I'm Rick Becker, host of the Irish Baseball Podcast. Right now, you are looking at images from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. All this year to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, I am trying to put a spotlight on Irish immigrants and Irish Americans who have made a major impact on the nation's history. Today, I will be joined by Mark Maloy, an historian at the National Park Service. Maloy will be here to talk about John Fitzgerald. Among his other accomplishments, Fitzgerald served as aide-de-camp to General George Washington at Valley Forge. First of all, Mark Maloy, thank you so much for joining us on the Irish Baseball Podcast. Now, if you could get us started by just telling us, who is John Fitzgerald?
John Fitzgerald is I think a real hero of the Revolution that's often overlooked. A lot of people never heard of him, but he was very close to George Washington personally. And the more I've researched him, the more I find him really fascinating. And I think he really does embody really kind of the Irish Catholic experience during the Revolution. Irish immigrants play a huge role in the American Revolution. Some estimates of the Continental Army is that almost a third of the Continental Army is made up of Irish immigrants. And the Irish Catholics are often overlooked because most Irish Catholic immigration to this country doesn't really happen until later in the 19th century. But there were some here, and I think John Fitzgerald is probably one of the more prominent ones that was remembered by Washington and many in his day, but over the years has been generally forgotten. But was really witness to some of the most dramatic and important moments of the Revolutionary War.
So when we talk about Irish Catholics in the Revolutionary military, and there's the 19th century, we have the Spanish-American War, we have the Civil War, and a lot of times during those conflicts, Irish Catholics weren't treated very well in the military. They definitely came through in the Civil War for the Union. Some did fight for the Confederacy, but we've had people on the show who've talked about the big impact they had on the Union military. The Spanish-American War, the San Patricios actually switched sides and started the Mexican-American War, the San Patricio actually switched sides and fought for Mexico. So what was it like in the Revolutionary War? Were Irish Catholic soldiers appreciated in Washington's military?
Yeah, that's a great question. And those examples you cited, I think are much more well known to Americans today. There've been movies and stories about the St. Patrick's and the Irish Brigade during the American Civil War, and there's a lot of pride and storytelling around that. And yes, the Revolution is much overlooked, and I think, like I said, a lot of that is much smaller numbers of them that were fighting in the Revolution. Now, like I said, there was a large number of Irish. Now, most of those Irish were what we call Scots Irish. They were Protestants who had come over, and so there is that Irish ancestry. But as far as Irish Catholics, there was a much smaller number of them that are actually going to be fighting in Washington's army. Now, to really understand, you have to go back to the history of Ireland and the history of the Irish Catholics in Ireland at this time in the 1770s. They are a really persecuted people in their own home country. Many of them didn't have the opportunity to come to the New World. Fitzgerald is one of those, and like I said, when you start looking at the history of Ireland and you see how much land there was, and Irish Catholics were often disbarred from owning much of the land, they were really kind of a serf class even though they made up the majority of the island. When Irish Catholics came to America, which was prominently, settled by Protestants, they would have found a very anti-Catholic sentiment through much of the colonies. In fact, here in Virginia, the Irish Catholics were not allowed to even celebrate their or worship in their own way in public. So Fitzgerald, he comes over in the 1760s. There is no Catholic church in Virginia. He would not be able to legally worship in public, and he would have private masses in his own home. And like I said, that's kind of that was typical for a lot of the colonies. Even Maryland, which most people think of as this Catholic haven, and for a few years it was. But by the time of the Revolutionary War, it's also outlawed in Maryland too. So there's strong anti-Catholic sentiments. Now, when the war breaks out, George Washington specifically is going to attempt to tamp down a lot of the anti-Catholic sentiment. Some people have claimed, for instance, there was a common celebration that many Protestants held, Guy Fawkes Day, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic undertones to the celebrations. Washington outlaws that in his army. Now, is that because he's an open-minded person who really, wants to welcome Catholics into the country? Or is it to curry the favor of France, who is a predominantly Catholic country? I'm sure there was a little bit of both of that in there. But yeah, no, for the Catholics that were in Washington's army, they would have suffered prejudices that continued in the country, as you mentioned, all the way up to the Mexican War, where it gets so bad that men are deserting to the other side to fight with the Mexicans who were predominantly Catholic. But yeah, I think if you're looking at ethnicity, there are a lot of Irish, but the Catholics in particular are going to suffer more prejudices than their Protestant brethren.
And do you think it did play a major part in the way that some of these soldiers were accepted when France did step up big time to help the revolutionary cause, and even Spain helped as well? So those are two predominantly Catholic countries who were playing a big part in helping the colonies fight against the British Army.
Yeah, no, and I do think that there does begin to be kind of a change in some of the attitudes for differences in religion, and you really kind of see that through all the different Protestant sects too throughout. I mean, you have Quakers from Pennsylvania fighting alongside, Catholics from Virginia and Protestants from New England. All these different sects now are fighting alongside each other. Everybody is expressing a belief in God and His importance in this conflict. But it's shortly thereafter that you see, one of the most important things in 1760 or 1786, just shortly after the war ends, is when Thomas Jefferson writes the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and that finally gets rid of the barring of religious differences in Virginia. And that's going to lead, specifically John Fitzgerald to play an important role in founding the Catholic Church here in Virginia. But all of these different, you really start to see, and then of course with the Constitution, the importance of tolerance and allowing different religious sects to be able to worship freely in this new world. And this was new because you really don't see that in the old world, where you have majority religions that are infused with the state. Here, all of a sudden, there's an opportunity for all these different sects to live alongside each other in the new world.
So, as we get close to this 250th birthday, 250th anniversary, people are going to be talking about Valley Forge a lot. This is one of the most famous moments of the revolution, and he is very much a part of it. John Fitzgerald. So, what role did he play specifically at Valley Forge, and how did he impact the outcome of the war?
Yeah. So, and I'll just give you a little brief background too. So when Fitzgerald he comes to Virginia and he settles in Alexandria, Virginia, and Alexandria is mostly associated with George Washington. George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, is just a few miles down the road. So this is the town where Washington would spend his time, and he becomes friends with John Fitzgerald. And when militaries start organizing to fight the British, Fitzgerald is one of the first volunteers. He's made an officer in the militia here. When the war actually breaks out and George Washington is named commander in chief, a regiment is set up here called the Third Virginia Regiment, and John Fitzgerald gets a commission as a captain, and then he's quickly promoted to major. And later in 1776, he gets all the way up to lieutenant colonel, and he's named an aide de camp to George Washington. Now, aide de camps were kind of around the general all the time. They did all the paperwork. They did, kind of kept all the things around headquarters in order. Washington only had a handful of aide de camps, but Fitzgerald is by his side really in what I would say is the darkest moment of the entire Revolutionary War. That was in the winter of 1776. It looks like the revolution is about to be lost. Washington and his army is dying on the banks of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. Washington's writing letters back saying that he literally writes, "I think the game is pretty near up." And these letters, which you can still see today, are written in the handwriting of John Fitzgerald. So he's by Washington's side, writing these letters as Washington dictates them to him. But Fitzgerald is with Washington when he crosses the Delaware River and attacks the Germans that were stationed in Trenton. A few days later, John Fitzgerald witnesses what I think is the most dramatic moment of the entire war. Some British redcoats were attacking Washington's army outside of Princeton, New Jersey. It looks for a second like this small group of redcoats is going to destroy Washington's army when Washington himself rode up right into the middle of the battle, musket balls flying all around his head. Washington draws his sword. It says, "Parade with me, my brave fellows. There's just but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." And Fitzgerald, we know this because Fitzgerald is going to tell this story for years afterwards. Fitzgerald says he sees both armies aim their muskets at each other. Washington was right in the middle, just 30 yards from the British, and they all open fire at the same time. Fitzgerald covers his hat over his eyes because he didn't want to see Washington cut down in front of him. When the smoke clears, though, there's Washington riding up and down, not hurt at all. One of Washington's officers says, wrote after the battle, you know, "I'll never forget what I experienced when I saw him at Princeton. When I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, his important life hanging as it were by a single hair, with 1,000 deaths around him. Believe me, I thought not of myself." And the Americans were able to charge forward and drive the British off the field, saving the revolution. And there was Fitzgerald right in the middle of all of that. But yeah, Fitzgerald's going to stay with the army throughout 1777. And like you mentioned, in the winter of 1777, they're going to go to this place called Valley Forge. And we often think of it being covered in snow and ice and being just a freezing cold winter. A lot of that, it didn't happen. The later winters are going to be even colder and worse. But what happened was disease just spread throughout all the ranks. And Washington's army is going to go into Valley Forge with about 12,000 men. Only 10,000 are going to come out on the other end. So about 2,000 men are going to die of disease in that winter in Valley Forge. And Fitzgerald, again, is in Washington's headquarters as Washington's trying to get supplies, trying to get provisions for his troops that are quite literally dying in their huts there at Valley Forge. But the amazing thing about Valley Forge is they train, they prepare, they continue to become a better fighting force. And that winter, France officially comes in on America's side during the Revolution, which kind of shifts the entire balance of power. And the American army marches out of Valley Forge better than it was when it marched in. They're going to attack the British at a place called the Battle of Monmouth. And during the fighting there, again, John Fitzgerald right by Washington's side. During the fighting, though, a musket ball actually wounds Fitzgerald. So he actually does shed his blood. And then he's going to go back to Alexandria to recover, and he'll spend the rest of the war back home in Virginia.
And then after he returns to Alexandria, he starts a mercantile business, and then he actually runs for mayor. He wins, he becomes the mayor of Alexandria, and he does later work with Washington in some of his business ventures back in Virginia. Is
Yeah.
his Irishness, is his Catholicism what keeps him out of the federal government, or was he not looking for that?
That's a great question. And you're right, because there were prejudices against Catholics, but that didn't stop some other Catholics from being involved in the federal government. But John Fitzgerald, yeah, really is kind of becomes a hometown hero after he returned to Virginia after being wounded, and like you said, he sets up a business and he continues to live in Alexandria. But the war wasn't over, and in fact, the war is going to come really right up to his front doorstep in April 1781. A British fleet comes up the Potomac River and kind of sends everybody into an alarm. And John Fitzgerald's going to rally the militia that was in the Alexandria area, and they march down to an area just off the Potomac River, an area which is today called Jones Point Park, which is a part of the National Park Service today. And they are going to man a battery there. Now, the British, they see all these soldiers right there near Alexandria, so they're not going to even attempt to land any soldiers or try and take the city. So they hang out there for a day and then they go back down the Potomac River. Now, they did raid and burn different plantations along the river. They even went to George Washington's home in Mount Vernon. And Washington's caretaker, his cousin, Lund Washington, actually goes down to the British and gives them liquor and cakes and other things and basically pleads for them to save Washington's home. And they do. They don't touch the house, which when Washington finds out about that, he's furious. He said he would have preferred his house burned to the ground than give anything to the British. But I am glad they did that because otherwise we wouldn't have that historic site today. But yeah, Fitzgerald is kind of a hometown hero, and like you said, he's going to become mayor. He does become very involved in the business ventures. One of the big ones is a venture called the Potomac Company, which Washington wanted to build kind of canals going out west to try and he was really understood that there's going to be a westward movement of colonization out towards the western lands. He wanted to open those up, and Fitzgerald joins him in that canal venture, which is today also part of the National Park Service, a place called Great Falls Park. And up there are remnants of the old canal they actually did build up there. But you're right. He doesn't become very involved in federal politics, but he was a strong supporter of the federal government. In fact, George Washington in 1788, on St. Patrick's Day, he attends a banquet with John Fitzgerald in Alexandria. Washington was looking to get locals to support the new federal constitution because Virginia had to ratify it. And John Fitzgerald shows his support for the new federal constitution. And in thanks and in return, Washington is going to donate money to John Fitzgerald to build a Catholic church in Virginia. That church will eventually be built and is today St. Mary's Catholic Church in Alexandria, Virginia. But this was really kind of the beginnings of the Catholic Church in Virginia, and I think Fitzgerald was really kind of focused on those kinds of local politics more than he was on many of the national politics.
Does that church still stand today, or can you visit it?
So the original church that was built doesn't stand today, but the congregation still exists, and they did build a church in the 19th century that is down in Alexandria, and it was actually recently made a basilica, and it is recognized as the first Catholic church in Virginia. And yes, St. Mary's Catholic Church, Old Town Alexandria. It's a beautiful church, and like I said, they have plaques on their walls talking about John Fitzgerald helping to found that church back in the 1780s and 90s.
So, being Irish, being Catholic, does John Fitzgerald have a connection to wanting to fight the British because of his Irishness? Or at this point, does he just consider himself maybe not an American, but at least a Virginian? Like, is he fighting this fight because of his adopted country, or is he fighting it because of his ancestral homeland?
That's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, he obviously harbored a lot of uh, animosity on how, his people were being treated back in the old country. However, I do think he was embraced, or he really embraced the his new American country. In fact, George Washington is going to nominate him for some position, and as a letter of reference, Washington himself says, that he's a son of old Ireland, but that he is first and foremost an American. And I mean, when you have George Washington saying that about you, I mean, I think your bona fides for being an American patriot are pretty set. And I think I do see a lot of, you see it with John Fitzgerald, as soon as that statute of religious liberty is passed, he's immediately working to establish a church here. He does marry a Catholic girl from Maryland. And so, I think his Catholic faith and his Irishness were obviously really key to his identity. But I think he really did embrace everything about being an American and fighting for his new hometown of Alexandria. In the few letters that we do have personally from him, I haven't seen any animosity given back towards his neighbors as far as any of the prejudices he had to endure. And his love of Washington, I think it comes out in all the stories he tells. A lot of these stories about Fitzgerald we get from Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, who grew up in Alexandria and heard these stories firsthand from John Fitzgerald. And like I said, there's a true pride in Virginia and in the United States of America every time John Fitzgerald's talking about it. So I think it's a little bit of both. But I think, like I said, I would consider him really an American patriot, but that has this connection to the old world.
And I'm going to break one of the rules of interviews and podcasting here. And I'm going to ask a question where I don't know the answer. And I don't really know if you're going to know the answer, but we're just going to throw it out there. Because of the colonization of Ireland, would a lot of the British server, would a lot of the British military, the English military, would they have been Irish, or would it have been more of a professional army where they would have been dealing with the upper classes of England?
Um, you're talking about in the British Army?
Yes.
Yeah, so there were a large amount of the British military fighting in the Revolutionary War that were Irish. In fact, there's a whole regiment, the Volunteers of Ireland. And yes, most of the officers, and most of them are Protestant, but there are some Catholics in there as well. But there is a Lord Fitzgerald who does fight on the British side down in the Southern Campaign, who is a distant cousin of John Fitzgerald. And But yes, there were Irish, fighting on both sides in this conflict. And a lot of that's going to boil over to about 20 years after the Revolutionary War, in 1798 back in Ireland, when the Irish are seeing what America has accomplished over here, and they're wondering, and they're going to attempt to bridge the divide between Catholic and Protestant. They're going to form a society of united Irishmen, and they're going to try to fight together to overthrow British rule. That's going to lead to the bloody 1798 uprising, and Lord Fitzgerald, who fought on the British side in America, fights for the United Irishmen in 1798. He gets killed in the process. But you really kind of see the revolution that broke out here is going to spread even over into the old world. I often wonder. I haven't seen any letters. John Fitzgerald died in 1799, so I am curious as to what his thoughts on the 1798 uprising would have been, if he was reading about it back here in America. But it might just be one of those questions lost to time.
So I would like to just briefly talk about your work with the National Park Service, and if you could let everybody know sort of your credentials and why you are an expert on John Fitzgerald.
Yeah, so I've been working for the National Park Service for about 15 years now. I've worked at many different sites. The park I'm at right now is called George Washington Memorial Parkway, which sounds just like a roadway, but it's much more than that. There's about 15 different park sites along the parkway that we, interpret. One most prominent being Arlington House, which most people know as the cemetery today, but before the Civil War, it was Robert E. Lee's home. And Robert E. Lee's father-in-law was George Washington Memorial, or George Washington Parke Custis, the guy who interacted with John Fitzgerald and wrote down a lot of his stories. And we also, like I said, take care of Jones Point Park, which was the site of one of those skirmishes during the Revolutionary War. But I just love the history, especially of the Revolutionary War era. That Me and some other public historians created a blog called Emerging Revolutionary War, and I hope your followers can check us out. If you're interested in 250th anniversary things, we are trying to be at all the major anniversary events. We have a blog, we have social media, we have a book series. I've written a book about those battles around Trenton and Princeton that Fitzgerald prominently took part in. And like I said, and I also love being a Malloy. I have a lot of Irish heritage. I think that the Irish history in this country is just fascinating. And one of the big 250th anniversary events that I'll be at March 17th, which of course is St. Patrick's Day, was the day that the British finally evacuated Boston in March of 1776. The Americans took over the city of Boston, and the password for that operation was Saint and Patrick. And so today, the city of Boston, they have a big parade, and it's often known as just St. Patrick's Day, but it's officially a city holiday for Evacuation Day, remembering the evacuation of the British troops. But it's a great combination of the Irish heritage and the Revolutionary War history. So, yeah, if any of your followers are interested in checking that stuff out, feel free to follow us at Emerging Revolutionary War.
It's kind of funny when you think about Evacuation Day being on St. Patrick's Day and how back then they would have had no way of knowing what the Irish would mean to the city of Boston in just 100 years from then, and how it was not an Irish city at all, and it was a much more upper crust city at the time. And to just see how history kind of comes back around is really interesting. Before we go, if you could just talk a little bit about your own personal Irish history and what it means to you, especially in your work as somebody who does do a lot of research into American history. How much do you find yourself coming up with some really good Irish American stories that you want to share?
Yeah, no, I'm always fascinated. I meet a lot of people, as I was mentioning before the show. I have a lot of Irish heritage personally. My mother's 100% Irish. All of her grandparents came, right off the boat. My father's largely Irish. I was actually able to find one of my father's ancestors was actually living in Virginia in the 1850s, working on the O&A Railroad here in Fairfax County. That adds a little bit of a personal connection, but I really see it throughout. There's a lot of characteristics of Irishmen that, I can relate to that you see throughout all of history. I love, reading about what was going on in the Union Army when they would have their celebrations of St. Patrick's Day in 1863, and you read some of these descriptions, and like I said, I can relate to it with my heritage of Ireland behind me. But I just find it fascinating to kind of see some of those threads going throughout history, and you can see it all over the place. What I think is fascinating is from this one little island on the other side of the world over here, you can be, whether it's in Savannah, Georgia, all the way up in Boston, all throughout, there's this common thread of, and there's a lot of things about being Irish, the independence, the stubbornness sometimes, all these things that, kind of unite us throughout our history. And then, finding those stories in the past. And there's almost always an Irish connection throughout so much of our history. So I just, yeah, personally, I like to claim that heritage, and it's really kind of neat to find it spread all throughout the United States.
Mark Maloy, thank you so much for joining us and especially for shining a light on an American and an Irish American hero who doesn't get enough attention.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for highlighting him. There are some local groups up here, a part of the Ancient Order Hibernians, who are working to, there are a few plaques to him throughout the city, but looking to continue to keep his legacy alive, especially now as we come up on the 250th anniversary of our country being a country. So.